All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the City Council work session on affordable housing. And I'm just going to kick it right over to our City Manager, Deborah Campbell.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Deborah Campbell, serving the role as City Manager. This is a really, really important work session for us. As you all know, we have some challenges and related to affordable housing and the provision of affordable housing. But I really want to go on record of saying that I believe that this community has embraced and has acknowledged that this issue, as it relates to delivering affordable housing, is a community issue. And what we are going to do today is to talk about the role of the city and the tools that we have available, and ensuring that as we move toward what we think is either solving or better managing this issue and this challenge, that we are equipped, again, from the city's perspective, with the tools and ensuring that we are prepared as it relates to our role in helping to address this issue. And so I'm going to now turn it over to Rachel Wood, who's going to kind of give us the run of show. And I think she's going to introduce a number of other people who will be speaking. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Deborah, and good afternoon, Mayor and City Council. As Deborah mentioned, today's focus is on the draft update to our affordable housing plan. And our affordable housing plan was first created in 2008. Last revised in 2015, and since these plans typically have a 10-year horizon, the timing is right for us to have an update to this important strategy document. The information you'll be reviewing today has been developed in consultation and collaboration with the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee, feedback from your Council Housing and Community Development Committee, as well as a robust community engagement strategy, which our consultant today will provide details on. Today's work session is intended to be conversational in nature. The presentation is divided in a few different sections, and at the end of each section, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. But again, because the intent is to be truly conversational, if you have questions throughout, please feel free to ask those questions if it will add to your understanding and to the benefit of today's conversation. I'm now going to turn it over to Sasha Vertunsky, our Affordable Housing Officer, who's been the primary staff point of contact for this important effort. And as Sasha's coming up, I want to thank her, as well as Alex Ruiz and Nikki Reed, our Community and Economic Development Director, for their work they've done as staff behind the scenes, making sure this important plan is updated. So Sasha?
Thank you, Rachel. Mayor and members of council, I'm Sasha Vertunsky. I'm the Affordable Housing Officer as a part of the Community Economic Development Department. Thank you so much for having this work session with us. We really appreciate your time. We know you all work so hard. Last July or August, we came before you for approval of a contract with Enterprise Community Partners. They are a nationally known nonprofit that specializes in affordable housing and community development. We've been hard at work with them over the past not quite a year, since September, working with the community, listening to stakeholders, working with AHAC, as Rachel said, and we feel like we've made a lot of progress. I want to introduce Jarrah Smith, who you know from March, your March meeting. He made a presentation to you back then. As this work starts to wind down, the real work begins. So we feel really good about where we're at and that we have a great blueprint for our future work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jarrah.
Good afternoon. Good to see you, Mayor and Council. Thank you for inviting me to this work session today. Again, my name is Jarrah Smith. I'm the Program Director for Equitable Housing Solutions at Enterprise Community Partners, and I've had the privilege of leading this affordable housing project from the consultant side. I just want to echo my appreciation for Nikki and Sasha and Alex. They've been absolutely fantastic to work with, as well as Deborah and Rachel, and all of you who've given me your time so generously over these past 9 or so months. So I'm here today to give you an update on the Affordable Housing Plan. Some of the key takeaways are that the Affordable Housing Plan has a 10-year planning horizon and identifies tangible strategy recommendations to help build a more equitable and sustainable housing ecosystem in the community. The Affordable Housing Plan update process began in September of 2023 and is nearing its completion. The Affordable Housing Plan was first established in 2008 and then updated in 2015. It's been a while, and a couple things have happened since then, so it seems like a good opportunity to update it. As a part of the update process, we included reviewing several existing city tools and policies, which we'll be discussing later today, and specifically the Land Use Incentive Grant Program, the Housing Trust Fund, the previous Affordable Housing Bond, and policies that impact city-owned land and how it's developed for affordable housing. We'll also be discussing some of the actual strategies that aren't just related to those 4 tools today, the ones that we prioritized for the first 3 years of the 10-year planning horizon based on the impact and what is within the city's power to feasibly implement in the first 3 years. So as Rachel mentioned, there is going to be 3 sections to this presentation. Number 1 is the Affordable Plan overview, then we're going to talk about the tools, and then we'll talk about the first 3 years of recommendations. So here's the overview. I believe you've all seen this before. This was essentially our process for developing the Affordable Housing Plan. We broke it up into these 5 stages of research and discovery, where we conducted our community engagement, our stakeholder interviews, and our data analysis, synthesizing our findings to try and identify needs. Then we built our policy framework, which helped us to develop our goals for the Affordable Housing Plan. Once we had our overarching goals, we were able to look more specifically into strategies that could help achieve those goals. And then finally, figuring out how to implement the plan in terms of who's going to lead it, what is the actual strategy, when is it going to happen, and how is it going to get funded. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that we centered racial equity throughout this entire project. I've said this before, I'll happily say it again. It's not every city that does a housing plan. It's not every city that does an affordable housing plan. And it's certainly not every city that requests an affordable housing plan that centers racial justice. And so I really just want to thank you all again for giving me the opportunity to work on this plan, because it's been a real gratifying and experience for me personally. So I'm going to take you just through a couple quick summary slides of the findings. This one is particularly new, I think, to you all. The top line for this particular slide is that, based on our population projections, we're estimating that the city is going to need to build another 14,000 homes by the year 2050 just to keep up with current population growth trends. And that doesn't even necessarily take into account adding to the supply to help increase affordability in that capacity.
Can you say, that's in the city, not in the county, just in the city?
Correct.
Can you say approximately how many housing units currently exist in the city? Well, we have a percentage increase here, so I guess we could
It's
extrapolate.
about 40,
Yeah, it's like
42.
40, yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
A couple other things to note that I know that you're all familiar with, but certainly impact this number and the population growth over the next 32 years, is that the city is aging, it's graying and getting older, that the majority of the population growth will likely be due to in-migration. Seeing as the city's population is growing older, the city's population would actually decrease if there were not in-migration into the city. And of course, we all know that the city is experiencing a precipitous decline in its Black population. So for our community engagement, we had essentially 3 major prongs of community outreach. Number 1, we spoke with our resident engagement roundtable, who were members of the community that served as ambassadors and comprised of residents who would be most impacted by the housing affordability outcomes. So that was affordable housing developers, it was people living in public housing, it was those who would be most impacted by the plan. So in January was our first major outreach initiative where we focused on community housing visions and strengths and needs, and that helped shape our needs assessment, identify our goals and what kind of strategies we'd be looking at. And then in phase 2, we came back in March and we solicited input on our preliminary framework and our strategies, which helped build our final plan. And that's when I was last able to have the privilege of speaking with all of you. In the first phase, we were able to have meaningful contact with over 500 people. In phase 2, we had over 200 or nearly 200 people meaningfully engaged with the process. We really wanted to make sure that renters and homeowners were represented, because oftentimes homeowners can be more represented in these kinds of engagements. We also were really pleased that the majority were low or moderate income residents that we were able to engage with. And recognizing that the city's housing market extends beyond the city limits, there were some people outside of or in the county who participated as well. All these key themes I think you're fairly familiar with, but one that really stuck out to me was that just how clearly residents felt that the new development was not intended for them and for existing residents. That's certainly something that can be felt everywhere, and I experienced that a lot, but there wasn't the same kind of anti-growth, anti-population growth antagonism in these kinds of experiences that I've seen elsewhere. It was more that there was a understanding that Asheville's changing, Asheville's growing, but if it's changing and growing, I want it to be benefiting me too, and not just the people who are moving here. So a quick executive summary here of the plan and our findings. The city obviously has a problem with those being housing costs overburdened. 36% of all Asheville households are paying more than 30% on housing costs, and those people are more likely to be people of color, renters, and low-income households. As I said, the city should anticipate 14,000 new homes being needed to be built by 2050 just to keep up with population growth. Population growth will largely be driven by in-migration, many of whom, if not the most of whom, may have a higher average income than the current Asheville resident. This can lead to something called equity migration, which is when higher incomes put added pressure on Asheville's already competitive housing market, which likely contributes to the displacement and equity migration that we're seeing today.
Can I ask you about that?
Yes.
So whenever I see things that say we'll need to increase by X number,
Sure.
what happens if we don't? Does the population not grow, or do we just end up with the equity migration discussion? So if we stop building tomorrow,
Yeah. Well, I mean, people are going to move here. There is a 2% vacancy or 3% vacancy in the city, right? So I don't know what it would look like to shut down development completely, but the market would get hotter because people would want to move here. People are going to move here with higher incomes. Rents are going to go up. Housing costs are going to go up. So the idea is that producing that 14,000 households will at least keep the city even with where it is today.
because I was wondering if it leads to sprawl, or I'm saying if there's literally no place
Right,
to live.
right, yes. Well, so,
But we have examples of communities where that's happened, like in Boulder, Colorado even, or places that have this finite limitation on growth. It just blows up the prices in the city.
But does that increase the population, I guess is what I'm saying? Do the prices go up and the numbers living in remain
Well,
the same?
I mean,
or
if you
keep
don't
coming?
build any more housing units, you can't, I mean, in theory, you can't really increase the population.
So what I'm getting to is at least I often hear people go, well, if you keep building, they keep coming. So stop building and then they won't come.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't really work like that, because then people with higher incomes just displace people for the scarcity of the housing that is in existence. And what you see in big cities, or that have, like if you go to a Dallas or a Denver, a place like that, they take little properties, push over the former house there and build their, lot to lot line, big house. That's what you see.
Triggering gentrification in that neighborhood, yeah. We talk about this a lot because it's awkward to say, we also need expensive housing, but we do. We're
Right.
missing housing across all incomes, right?
yes, absolutely. This plan is focusing on 80% and below AMI just because that is the federal definition of affordable housing, but you're absolutely right. Everybody is feeling the housing crisis in Asheville and the country. So I just want to say that, based on our findings, the community's feelings are validated based on this evidence, of the feeling that the growth is occurring and it's leaving them behind. And so the Affordable Housing Plan has developed strategies to help the city equitably preserve and grow housing affordability opportunities for its current and future residents. One addendum that I do want to add to this executive summary slide that I really only kind of came up with last night is the fact that these planning exercises are often a list of things that you're not doing. You all are doing a lot to support affordable housing. I've worked in a lot of different communities of similar size, smaller, larger, in the South and elsewhere across the country, and I just want to recognize that you all are doing a lot. This is a national affordable housing crisis. This is a city of 100,000 people, and you're located in the state of North Carolina. So you're doing a lot given those restraints and those factors relating to affordable housing. So a lot of the strategies are essentially keep doing what you're doing well, but do it a little bit better. And then there are definitely many new ideas as well, but I just want to say that you're doing a lot of what you can. And so the narrative that the city is not doing enough to support affordable housing, I just want to push back a little bit on that, because based on the work that I do in a lot of other communities, you all are very creative and inclusive, open-minded, and you're being so proactive. So I just want to emphasize that fact that you all are doing a lot, and the first couple of years is going to be keep doing what you're doing, but do it a little bit better, and then expand your impact by growing capacity, growing funding, and providing a regulatory environment that's amenable to affordable housing construction. So these are the 5 goals that we developed as a result of our community feedback, our stakeholder engagement, and our data analysis. So number 1 goal is to promote policies and resources that help existing residents stay in Asheville. Of course, that's again a reflection of this theme that we heard over and over. And actually we have that particular section broken up into 3 sections itself, one that looks specifically at protecting renters, one that looks at protecting homeowners, and one that looks at systems level changes that can protect existing residents. We also need to preserve existing affordable housing and improve housing quality. There is some affordable housing in the city right now. Some of it is threatened with exiting the affordability period or whatever the case may be, or being purchased by speculators if it's a naturally occurring affordable housing. And so it's really important that the city prioritize those opportunities that currently exist. Of course, population is growing, and one of the only ways to increase affordability is to increase the supply of housing to meet the diverse needs of current and future residents. Underpinning those 3 goals, we have aligning place-based policies and programs with related city initiatives, and so that's recognizing that the city of Asheville is not one monolith, that some of these policies will be more effective in different parts or different areas, and so we want to make sure that there's a couple things in there that are more geographically targeted. And then last, and maybe the most important, is broadening and strengthening the affordable housing ecosystem. As I've said before, I'm astonished by how many players there are in the nonprofit service provider and developer space. You know, the fact that there's an affordable housing officer at all, there is a broad ecosystem in Asheville already. It's about how to bring everyone together, how to bring everyone to the table, and how to expand the work that everyone's already doing so well. On top of those 5 goals, we have these 2 cross-cutting priorities. So essentially, we found that these 2 issues of prioritizing and incentivizing efforts that meet the greatest needs and protecting against displacement in all forms, that really applies to all 5 of those goals. That's why we're calling them cross-cutting strategies. And so it's cross-cutting priorities. So for instance, in the plan, you'll see that each strategy will have an icon next to it that indicates, is it preventing against displacement? Is it increasing access to affordable housing for those with the greatest need? Is it advancing racial equity? That's a 3rd one that we have as well. So it's a way that we, as we put this plan together, we just found these to be so fundamental that we were asking ourselves with each and every strategy, are these advancing or at least not inhibiting these particular cross-cutting priorities? Okay. I will pause there for questions on the general process and how we got here today, and then I'll dive into the city tools.
I have one question.
Yeah.
And it was really about the previous 2 slides back. Thank you. This overburdened first part.
Yes.
So historically, we've been saying that about half of our households are cost burdened. And I was trying to recall in my head if we were thinking about Buncombe County as a whole or Asheville as a whole.
Probably renters.
Just renters. So you've layered in okay, I was wondering if we somehow had improved the situation, but you have just reconfigured
It's
the
'cause it's
data.
homeowners too. Who
Okay,
are
so
remarkably
50% of renters, a different percentage of homeowners.
less. Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, and maybe it's just some level setting, so it'll come up later. But I know my colleagues have brought up the intersection of race and gender, because I know that we looked at that in some of our Thrive studies. And did you get a chance to go into that intersection of, I specifically think of our conversations that council's had about the impact for Black women in Asheville?
That's a great question. And so we did not, for instance, for Luigi, we didn't conduct a survey of Luigi tenants to determine their gender and race or income or whatever the case may be. But one of our strategies, and actually one that we kind of are adding relatively recently, is specifically talking about data capturing and the need to start implementing that more rigorously in the city. But we don't have, I guess I can't speak specifically to Black women's housing conditions in the city.
I also think about our Stop the Harm audit, and we've been talking about a lot what it looks like for us to record data as we go.
Yeah.
And so if every study we have shows us that we're still not capturing that, well, we might miss the opportunity to heal some wounds and move forward in a
Yes.
healthier way as a community. So it's just something I'm keeping in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's an exceptional point because some of these strategies we want to make sure are in place before we make other policy revisions, right? So we want to have a good data capturing system in place before we, for instance, update Luigi to capture that kind of information. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other questions or thoughts on the process? Okay, city tools. All right, so here are the 4 city tools, financing tools that we took a deeper look at in our plan. So of course there's Luigi, the Land Use Incentive Grant, which is a tax abatement grant program established in 2011 to incentivize market rate developers to include affordable homes in their projects. The Housing Trust Fund, which is a flexible low-interest loan provider established in 2000 to serve a variety of needs for low and moderate income residents. There's the Affordable Housing Bond from 2016, which is a debt security issued by the city to support the Housing Trust Fund and other affordable housing programs. And there's city-owned land, which is leveraging city-owned property to support new affordable housing development. And so for each of these, I'm going to show 2 slides, one where we analyzed or give a little bit of a production overview, and then we took a 3 E's approach to analyzing these. So we looked at equity, efficiency, and effectiveness. It's difficult to kind of measure these all in the same capacity, and often they work together, so it's hard to determine exactly what kind of credit goes to which one. So we took this 3 E's analysis to also demonstrate that the productivity of these tools does go beyond just the sheer number of units that it has produced to date. So I'll be doing one slide with the production overview, those 3 E analysis, and then going into recommendations for each one. First, though, a quick summary of the city's subsidized housing. Since 2001, 2,315 affordable housing units have been subsidized by the city through Luigi, the Housing Trust Fund, conditional zoning, or the bond. 36% of those have supported homes for families at 60% AMI or below, and 64% of those units support 80% AMI or below. According to the data that we have available to us, at least 107 units are threatened with expiring over the next decade, though it could be more, especially if you consider naturally occurring affordable housing. So when we were looking at these tools, we asked ourselves, what's missing from the toolbox? What can we do to align the city tools with key plan recommendations? And our analysis of the city's existing tools indicates that these particular activities and programs could be supported by existing or revised city tools to help meet today's housing needs. So number 1, that's more options for 50 to 60% or below renters and homeowners. Longer affordability periods of 30 years or more. Home repair programs for eligible homeowners and landlords. Affordable Housing Acquisition Fund. A funders collaborative, which I'll get into these a little bit more later. Strategic land banking. A down payment assistance program or some other form of home buyer assistance. Or an emergency rental assistance and or housing stability fund. So we're asking ourselves, these seem to be great strategies and recommendations that might work well for the city, might meet those needs. How can we tailor these tools to potentially fit these particular recommendations? So first up, Luigi. It's produced 515 rental homes to date, 157 of which are constructed and occupied. When we were looking at equity, we of course all know that because Luigi targets primarily 80% AMI, often the units are too expensive for most Black households in Asheville, considering the median income for Black households in Asheville is 50% of the city median income. There was no demographic data available to us to assess Luigi's outcomes, though, because we just don't know who's living in them. But again, that's part of the recommendations, is better data capturing. So looking at efficiency, how much does it cost relative to output? All the projects that have received Luigi funding cost between $4,328 to $81,482 per unit over the course of the lifetime of the grant period. So that's typically about 20 years. The average is $45,122 subsidy per unit for the lifetime of the grant. So that comes down to just $2,256 per unit per year. That's actually a pretty good deal. $45,000 for a unit over 20 years is pretty remarkable when you think about how in some of the bigger cities it's over $1 million, or even in Raleigh it's $160,000 to produce a single unit, to subsidize a single affordable housing unit. And $2,256 per year can be broken down into $180 a month, which obviously, you know, at scale is a lot of money.
So, but this is for all 515 units,
Correct.
and construction costs have changed since the inception, increased.
Sure.
It's interesting to hear you say it's not bad. When I think about it in the context of federal housing subsidies,
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, I know all local governments, including us, are trying our hardest to leverage affordable housing units, but we've, at least some of us, including myself, have sort of posed the question of, given the size of our annual budgets and the cost per unit, is it really great?
Right.
Because if you look at the size of the federal government's budget and the number of housing units across the entire country that they're subsidizing and making available, it feels like for a city's budget, it's disproportionate.
Sure.
And also, I was gonna say, this is great, it's just not equitable.
Yes.
Or we don't know because we don't have the data.
Well, and that's, because you were here the day when Dr. Carter presented the
Yes.
Cease the Harm.
Yep.
And he kept repeating that anytime there is no data, by definition,
Yes.
there is harm.
Right.
So essentially what I see you're saying is Luigi, from a racial equity standpoint, is likely causing harm.
Yes.
We don't have data on the other
But-
tools either, do
we've had to make basically implications or presumptions based on the affordability level that the particular tools are supporting.
So to hear what you're saying, for local government subsidies of affordable housing in dollars, when you look at other communities, so far, we're not paying the level that you're seeing in some of these other communities, which sounds really high, too. It
Right.
sounds really, yeah.
We're
I would
moving
say-
that way though, right? We're approving higher and higher amounts,
Well,
so.
and the county's most recent projects, I think the Brevard Road one is at 90,000 per unit
Yeah.
without the land costs.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I don't see how that's avoidable, given the cost of construction.
Right.
What's amazing to me is the second to last bullet point that, we're often complaining that the state does not allow for inclusionary zoning, and we think that would just really help tremendously, but our Luigi program is outperforming.
Most inclusionary programs require between 10 and 20% affordability, but the average number of units is 22% affordable in Luigi-supported buildings. So, yeah, granted, an inclusionary zoning policy means that you don't have to give a tax
There's no
grant.
subsidy.
Yeah,
It's a totally
exactly.
different animal. It just creates a by right
Just interesting
project.
in unit return, that's
But
fascinating.
yes, it is.
Well, but
Have you worked in other North Carolina cities?
I have worked in, what was it called? My former, yes, I've done a lot of studying in North Carolina. My family's down here. they're mostly in the Raleigh area, the communities that I've worked with.
I just sometimes wonder if inclusionary zoning has some kind of change in our future at all. You know, if anybody knows North Carolina,
You mean the legislature suddenly going to allow us to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
are there enough cities that are fighting for it in North Carolina?
Seems unlikely.
Esther, is the point that you were getting at, I heard several points. One was, you know, the federal government has way more money than we do, and so just weighing the value of what we put in. But I feel like there were several pieces of a budget play that I wasn't fully picking up on. I guess what you were saying is if we defer receiving the money to our budget, right? Like, these things grow.
Well, it's not even defer, we're not going to get it.
Yeah.
It's $2,256 per unit per year that will not come to the city coffers.
So you're not even, okay, so you're, Okay.
I just think that there are many, many good things in the world that are needed. There are many things that cities could do, that we don't do, that we could do, and we could spend money on them, and they're very important in the community. I think if you ask community members, they would say that these things are very important. Homelessness services, affordable housing, you know, the list goes on. This is not the traditional role of a city historically, and so cities are stepping into these needs, are very critical. I'm just posing the question of, at what point is it exceeding our you know, what we have to focus our budget on in our core services? At what point are we stepping outside and depriving some of the core service needs in an effort to, you know, it's a noble effort. This is a noble effort. I just wonder, given the cost of it, we just want to, and this is one of the reasons for the study. It's very important to understand, given the size of our $250 million budget, I mean, can we really afford to subsidize single units of housing to at this degree?
especially
with our
the
budget?
ones that are the 60 to 80% AMI, because that's the real differentiator with
that
this
is- and
tool,
yeah.
is that this is.
Or do we create a zoning ordinance that says you can do a by right project if you include, you know, 60, 80% of units,
Right.
10%, you know, or whatever, and without our subsidy in the mix? Are there other
Yeah.
tools that get us to the same goal?
Why did you say 60 to 80?
Well, I mean,
instead of
just because
60?
getting us to that, I think a lot of developers would throw in 20% or 80% of AMI because that's all like so close to market, you know, they're not, it's not a huge deal for them to do that.
Well, if they took vouchers, they could go lower and get to the same, and actually
Right.
end up better.
That's
Well,
probably,
and
the
if
answer
we
is probably
created-
all,
If we
both of them.
change the UDO to say, okay, you got a by right avenue, if you take vouchers and you go to 60%, you know, and it's not our subsidy, it's
Right.
just facilitating
Just the
them.
feds put in.
You know, that's all I'm saying. This is what we're doing. We're doing this study so that we can ask these questions and say, what is the best way to facilitate more affordable housing in our community?
And that's where I feel like if we're gonna stay true to our equitable, affordable housing goal, do we actually need to look at less and deeper affordability instead of many affordable units people can't afford?
I suspect the answer is
Is that
yes
where
to
we get
all
to-
these.
Yeah,
We
Yeah,
need
I don't
all
think
of
it's
them.
either
But
or.
one thing I'll remind us is that it's going to be really helpful to understand a full bond cycle and the return calendar on our HTF and Luigi, because we're in a sense, if we stick with low income or low interest loan funds and stop granting them at 0% or forgiving them, we are creating our own pipeline of revenues just for this purpose. It's almost like we're forcing an enterprise fund if we could stick to it. But where on the calendar does that money start coming back? You know, and I think we need to be looking at that, because some of this goes back to 2001, but we've been doing most
mean
of the
when
leach
we
in
start
5 years.
seeing-
The return of the revenue and return of the loans. You know, it's supposed to be a cycle that we're building, not always bleeding other funds dry. Kind of like we're talking about the transit and general fund. You know, how do we
I
get
mean,
it
I
to
guess
stand
the question
alone?
would be, I mean, would the housing not have been built but for? And that's supposed to be the case.
Yeah.
But what if it was but for a better zoning code that
Yeah,
allowed for
yeah. Let's do
by
it.
right construction
Let's
that
do it.
got to the same, you know, I'm just saying.
We've been talking about it for years. Let's do it.
Because, let's just ask a question. You said this was established in 2011, and the
She's on the slide before, yeah.
Okay, and the 515 rental units have been financed, but we only have 157 constructed and occupied.
Yes.
Okay.
Another
Does that
30
mean,
like,
does
a
that
month.
mean that that's a lot of
They're
money?
under
money-
construction.
Yeah, but that's still like money just still sitting there, right? I mean, it's not actually,
Well, the Luigi is based on the future revenues that it would get.
Yeah.
So what it would pay in future tax revenue, we're technically
You're just not.
rebating, we're accepting the payment and we're
Wow.
writing one back.
Already doing it.
Yeah, but we're not, the Luigi has been really successful in recent years. So those things are still being built, like the Avery
Except
right
for
now.
equitably. It-
Right, I don't mean
So it
to
depends on
preclude
where
that
that
point,
is.
but,
Yeah.
like the Avery right now is almost complete, and that one had like 30 or something, so that number is growing quickly, but we're just now seeing them open doors.
So to that point, Mayor, getting onto some recommendations, one of our top ones in the administrative column on the right is requiring the pro forma that the developers send to the bank to get loans to understand if this really is a but-for program or not. Because right now, the city doesn't know, but pro formas are required for housing trust fund applications, so why not require them for Luigi as well to understand that case? We're advocating, or we're suggesting that the city maintain the program with a couple of modifications. Number one, it could expand the scope to include acquisition and preservation of affordable housing. There could also be a similar policy made for mobile home communities. We're also recommending that the city revise the baseline or scoring system so that it reaches those deeper affordability levels or longer affordability. But as Councilmember Mosley so astutely pointed out, the question is going to be, do you want fewer units at a deeper affordability or more units at a higher affordability level? And that is more of a values question that I can't necessarily answer. But our recommendation is that you should probably go for AMIs that are 60 or 50% below, because those renters appear to be in the greatest need of affordable housing options. The city could also simplify the scoring system to achieve specific goals. For instance, a 50% tax grant over 20 years if you do 20% of affordable at 60% AMI, or 50% tax grant when affordability period is beyond 20 years. The benefit of that is it makes the process a lot easier and quicker and simpler. The challenge is that it may be harder for developers to fit those particular goals, so there's a couple trade-offs to that particular method. We're also recommending that the city update the scoring system to further incentivize developers to produce affordable housing in targeted geographies, like around access to transit and key job centers, and considering reevaluating the utility of some of the scoring activities that don't directly address affordable housing, like brownfield redevelopment, energy efficiency. I'm honestly not sure how much those are used, but if this is going to be an affordable housing tool, I would recommend it try to be an affordable housing tool. A couple of the other recommendations include adding staff capacity and support for better tracking and enforcement, as we've talked about, but perhaps setting a budgetary limit every year, either an annual limit or a per unit cap, raising the buy right thresholds for affordable housing projects, as you suggested, Mayor, developing a city-county Luigi partnership, addressing the point structure for voucher double dipping, advocating for a right of first refusal when affordability periods ends. That would require state enabling legislation, and introduce additional tracking and data tracking and evaluation measures, such as what does it look like cost per person, doing demographic surveys to see if, in fact, these units are benefiting the folks that we're hoping that they benefit.
And what do you do if they don't?
Then I guess you either revise the policy or put it on a moratorium, or
Okay. If you have a developer in 3 years and you find out that that developer is no longer, can you, okay.
no, I'm sorry, I think I misunderstood your question.
Would there be a way to rescind the Luigi
Or if they fail to comply.
if they fail to comply? Have you seen that done in other areas?
It'd be interesting, like a lump sum buyout or something.
Well, they get it annually, they get the
Right,
rebate
would you
annually,
just-
so can you,
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, because Luigi is a contractual process whereby obviously there is a requirement on both sides to fulfill the obligations. Part of the developer, it's meeting the conditions laid out as to the provision of affordable units. If that's not met, again, per the terms of the agreement when it's written, then certainly the city would not be obligated to extend the grants.
But there couldn't be any demographic requirements, though, right?
Well, let me answer that twofold. I don't believe we currently require demographic information. But I would not go so far as to say that we could not. Now, what I mean by that is if we requested the voluntary accumulation of demographic data, then I think that as part of a voluntary program such as Luigi, we could see what information we got. Now, I want to temper your expectations with that because you have to be very careful with federal fair housing laws and anybody coming in, especially with a rental situation, asking for their racial or gender identification. I think that would put some developers or some land sellers in an uncomfortable and difficult position to navigate. So it is possible on our side to request something that we would not be able to automatically require in a non-voluntary program,
Right.
but there's going to be some legal issues you'd have to navigate.
I had thought she said geographic, not demographic, but there's no
I-
reason for the.
I said, did I say geo? I
I'm,
meant
oh, it's
demographic.
okay. I had a
I
geographic
answered
question.
demographic.
And I had a follow-up geographic question. So, but I see that language here and we don't see it in other things, but since this is like a voluntary program, we can have it, right?
What do you mean by geographic information?
Well, this is a suggested using geographic areas as a target in our table.
Yeah, I think that is much more accessible, and purely because when we're talking about federal discrimination laws, you're talking about those protected classes which one would recognize of things, characteristics that you're not allowed to discriminate on. And because you're not allowed to discriminate on, it makes it somewhat difficult to collect that data, except in a voluntary situation, which again has to be done somewhat carefully. But geographic information is much more available and obviously not a protected class in and of itself.
I want to speak to one and then ask a question about another. The speak to one is, I think several of us have been lifting up the idea that having some of the environmental components in the Luigi matched a moment when we were looking for a tool to also reflect our climate values, and I think we still have those, but I do see that presenting builders with an either or when we're really trying to get to affordable housing with this tool, I think there's wisdom to that. However, I wouldn't want to cut it without having another strategy to support, because we are in a similar situation where we can't require a lot for protecting future buildings from the climate and building and resiliency. We can't go above and beyond building code. Right. So incentives are really the primary method we have to get the building stock we need to prepare for our climate future. So I see there being a lot of wisdom of it being uncoupled, but I wouldn't want to pull it if it wasn't going to land somewhere else, because we can't lose one of the very small tools we have for green building and climate resilient buildings.
And I would add to that and say that one of the things that I've learned with talking with developers and also tenants is the affordability of utilities. So when we're thinking about affordability, not just the cost of rent, but also keeping housing affordable, being able to keep people's energy bill low is part of that.
And then I did have a question of what's the why behind setting a budgetary limit?
So, I mean, that could be
Just for management of the process and containment?
for management of the funds, for to understand that, you know, the city will only allocate X million of dollars
So
per
we don't go
year.
broke doing this.
Right.
This is why that
tax
calendar
rebate.
matters.
I mean, but that's not
It's-
how it's interesting, it's not how we account for it in our budgeting, we show it as a liability in our budget. It's an annual liability in our budget, so it's,
So it's an
But it
accounting
has the
strategy.
revenue, right? On the other side, it has the revenue too. Yeah.
But it's an accounting strategy for consistency.
I wish we could just pretend it didn't exist at all, but whatever, that's the way
But
it's.
that's why it's a rebate. I mean, it gets paid and rebated, so
We're
we
not
have
supposed to
to.
call it a rebate.
It's not a
Yeah,
rebate.
It's actually a grant program. So that is why it's showed, as from an accounting standpoint, as a liability, because it's money that we have agreed to grant out. The taxes are paid.
Oh, I understood the legal term we had to say was rebate.
Yeah.
No,
we
we're
can't.
changing
No,
that
it's
now?
not.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's
we
not
did
the-
change
We
it
are,
to
we are
rebate
not
for that
allowed
reason.
to do
So
tax.
now we're
Land
calling
use
it a
incentive grant.
Well, we changed it from grant to rebate in my term.
I've always been told don't go.
No,
Anyway,
that's really
it's-
funny. Okay, grant, we'll go back to
Okay,
grant.
so what I was asking is that, what you're saying is that because, I mean, it still isn't a revenue impact for us. Let me say it differently.
It's
I get it
coming
that the
in.
money changes hands, but it's not like you're budgeting with this revenue in hand.
Yes, I hope we are.
You're
So I
budgeting to
think-
give a grant, but you're not budgeting services based on it.
So, right, that's true, but if we look at the next 20, 30 years, we have already agreed to forego about $18 million of tax monies. That's 18 million that we won't have to do the core services. So the idea behind this limit is to say, okay, we're gonna use this tool, but we're gonna limit it. We're not gonna do 6 million this year and 6 million next, we're gonna kind of cap it. Does that
I
make
mean, in
sense?
theory,
I
you
mean,
can't keep expanding the city's population and housing units that need services, but not have the revenue stream that comes with that to pay for the services. So it is an added, burden in that sense.
Yeah, I get all of that. It just,
I know, the math doesn't, it's like whatever, we weren't counting on it, so.
right, it doesn't, I don't see the affordable housing strategy behind it.
Behind a cap.
But it
Yeah.
don't, no, but you can't, like, let's say your entire city was units of deferred taxes, right? You wouldn't be able to pay for services, right? So
So-
you wouldn't have it, so there is a point at which you're
but it's very
overburdening your
theoretical.
budget with subsidy. You can only do so much.
Until those other ones come back online,
Yeah.
which is why that calendar's so important.
So if you had it rolling and you kept it capped.
That's what I
you
mean.
could-
Then our
yeah.
cap could keep growing and it could become like this
I-
and
and
stand.
It just seems like there's a lot of recommendations on here, and this one doesn't seem like
I get it.
as
It's hard.
hard-hitting as the
Well, we
other
don't know what the
ones.
cap is. Maybe they're gonna say the cap should be $30 million.
It seems like a great reason why we would want to strategize deeply affordable units.
Yes. And then
What's your percentage? You're going below 60 or where you?
Well, if we're getting to the spirit of the recommendation of 50 to 60 and then the vouchers, I've really appreciated, I know Antoinette, you brought up the idea of voucher set-asides. That can help us get closer to meeting that goal without having to provide as much subsidy. When, as you noted, Esther, the 88% AMI is getting really close to market.
And that covers 30 to 50, right? So we're talking 50 to 80 now.
Recognizing the time, I'd
Yep.
like to.
You just
keep going.
we're just gonna chat away.
Housing Trust Fund, quick summary. 716 units have been built at the 60% or below AMI, 835 at 80% or below. From an equity perspective, the applications give extra points to developers who provide greater affordability and longer terms of affordability. The average subsidy per rental unit out of the Housing Trust Fund is $25,000 per unit over the course of the grant or the loan. In terms of effectiveness, over 1,700 homes have been supported using the Housing Trust Fund. And this is an equity angle as well. Just in the last year alone, 84% of the Housing Trust Fund's dollars went to 60% AMI households, including 14% that were available for 50% AMI or below. So it demonstrates that the Housing Trust Fund is doing a great job at already supporting deeper affordability than Blue Beach currently does. Some recommendations are to continue your financial commitment to the Housing Trust Fund using a variety of funding sources, including the bond and the city's general funds to maximize its utility of the fund and its flexibility. Consider committing a dedicated funding source to the Housing Trust Fund to improve confidence and consistency. And so what that is it's either a tax or well, it's usually some kind of tax or a fee or something that, gets dedicated specifically to the Housing Trust Fund. In other cities, they specifically say 0.5% of the general fund will go towards the Housing Trust Fund, something that just makes it a little bit more simple and not a yes or no up and down vote every year. Developing a local housing funders collaborative to help leverage the dollars that Housing Trust Fund can bring to the table, specifically for land acquisition of naturally occurring affordable housing. Modifying the scoring to increase eligibility of developments located near capital improvement programs. One of our strategies is to really kind of align housing development with other city investments. And then last, to support home ownership and rental affordability through a home repair program. So the bond, in 2016, $25 million was issued. The city used it to buy 32.5 acres of land that produced 650 units of affordable housing. And it's really, I mean, I suppose depending on the semantics of Luigi, it is the primary vehicle for granting that the city has. In terms of looking at equity, the bond is incredibly effective at that. 94% of the units supported by the bond went to 30 to 60% AMI households. The bond is therefore really the most capable of reaching those deeper affordability levels. The granting authority can help build capacity for smaller and or nonprofit housing developers. Some of the biggest challenges when it comes to actually developing a project, especially for a smaller affordable housing developer, a small developer anyways, is the pre-development costs, like land acquisition, architectural fees, whatever the case may be, because that includes the most risk. And so anything that the bond can do to help support those lower or smaller nonprofits and affordable housing developers would be an equitable outcome. And then, of course, we wanted to note that the $1 million in down payment assistance that was initially allocated for the bond was not used. Looking at efficiency, the bond is very efficient at leveraging additional funding resources. Looking just at the land banking specifically, the city spent $3 million of its bond on pre-development and land banking costs and was able to leverage $9.8 million. So that's a 326% return on your investment. Additionally, if you look at the $5 million that was given to the Housing Trust Fund, they were able to leverage $19 million in additional construction financing. So one of the really big key takeaways about the bond is it is a huge mechanism for leverage. I would not recommend doing projects that don't have some kind of leveraged resource as a part of it, because this is clearly proven to be such an effective tool at getting other people to bring their resources to the table. In terms of effectiveness, land acquisition and land banking was also particularly effective, averaging $92,000 per acre, which I understand to be a pretty decent price for affordable property or for developable property in Asheville right now. One of the benefits of the bond is the ability to be the first one in when going into any investment or financial process. Often it's a question of who's going to be the first one to make the investment, take the biggest risk, and then once folks see other people getting in line and jumping in and investing, they're ready to as well. This bond allows the city to be that first one in and absorb some of that risk that might be more difficult for other players in the ecosystem to take. It's also effective at building nonprofit capacity. This takes time, though. That should certainly be recognized. But just look at the Haywood Street community development and how it was supported by the bond, and that's a great example. Of course, in terms of its effectiveness, it's most limited by the fact that all funds need to be used for capital costs. So for recommendations for the bond, we're saying that the city should continue to support the Housing Trust Fund, that it should serve as a mechanism for leveraging other public and private resources, possibly through a funders collaborative, which could just even boost that leveraging even more. The bond could be used to contribute to an affordable housing acquisition fund. And so when I say that, I'm thinking more of like a naturally occurring affordable housing acquisition fund. It could potentially be a land acquisition fund as well, but when I'm saying contributing to an affordable housing acquisition fund, that's generally what I'm talking about. We also think it'd be great to develop some kind of granting program for pre-development activities to support those smaller emerging affordable housing developers. That is, again, limited by the fact that the funds can only be used for capital costs, so it could be paired with the Housing Trust Fund or philanthropies or other sources of funding to help cover those softer non-capital costs as well. And then supporting home ownership through a home repair grants program and or a down payment assistance program. Administratively, if the city wanted to implement a bond cycle, that again would demonstrate more commitment and reliability for investors, for developers, similar to adding a dedicated recurring revenue source for the Housing Trust Fund. And administratively, we're recommending that the city investigate alternative funding sources, both public and private, I already said this, to capital than the non-capital, to cover the non-capital costs.
Do you have a community that you could point to if we wanted to learn more about what you're envisioning a funder collaborative would look like?
Yes.
Or could you send that in the future if it's not on the?
Yes.
Because, you know,
Yes.
I have
Yeah.
I've experienced that in my day job around philanthropy, that there's a lot of philanthropic collaborations involved, but we have a pretty thin philanthropic community here, and so I'm not sure if you're talking about philanthropic.
Being a part of it as
Community?
well, yes. Yeah, a funders collaborative in theory could involve banks, CDFIs, philanthropies, the city, the county, North Carolina Housing Financing Agency, anyone who has a financial investment in
Well, we have
affordable housing.
examples of that here, because like if you have a bank that's operating, and I forget what the name of the program is, they have to do so many loans around that fall into this category, like
The
Home
CRA.
Trust, and then you'll get Dogwood Endowment partnering on a project, and it'll be a tax credit based LIHTC project. I mean, so we
have
have plenty of
partners.
examples of that.
It's
but-
basic, exactly. It's creating a more consistent communication stream between those typical partners, rather than doing it on a one-off development project basis, instead having a regular understanding of what those goals are. Obviously, different people will have different goals, but just making that kind of partnership more of a,
Facilitating it more. I mean, right now, each applicant is having to cobble that together each time, and there is some blueprint for it, but they have to put together the pieces and have the knowledge of how the system works to some extent. And then if they meet with staff, they'll quickly learn the components of it, but
You know, one of the things we used to do regularly was a development forum where we
Yes.
would engage all of the people and the like lenders, builders, contractors, all the things, excuse me, and get them in a room for a day. And not only give them information, but also get information from them about what they were facing in the environment that was making it hard to achieve these goals. We've been talking about it coming back up and doing another one, and I think it would help. It's like a great next step to some of this stuff.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And similarly, one of our strategies is conducting that kind of education for developers, so they understand the resources that are available to them and how to cobble together these kinds of projects and partnerships. All right, city-owned land, 112 units have been produced in those three particular developments. In terms of equity, it does require that 20% of all units be at the 60% AMI or below. So it does, again, reaches a little deeper than Luigi, but still not necessarily getting all the way down to median household income for the city's Black residents. But the city's ability to sell land for less than market value allows emerging developers with less access to capital to take advantage of this particular resource. In terms of efficiency, the city is obviously foregoing the property sale and the taxes that would come from the particular property if they were to just sell it on the open market. It also can be a labor-intensive process from the staff perspective. And in terms of effectiveness, this is really best paired with either the Housing Trust Fund or bond dollars or some other resource. Again, this is something that the city should leverage and not use as just a component of a particular affordable housing project. So recommendations are leasing or selling property only to developments supporting 50 to 60% or below AMI, or extending affordability periods beyond 30 years or perhaps permanently. Ensuring that the city's equity goals are achieved and prioritized when the city is disposing of that property. And in the future, if if a land bank is established, consider granting or selling those properties to the land bank to create an initial reserve of properties, serve as collateral for additional loans, and could be used actually today as in collaboration with the Asheville Buncombe County Community, the Asheville Buncombe Community Land Trust. That's a typo. And then, of course, identifying any opportunities for streamlining the process from the city perspective. So getting back to that initial slide about how to align the city tools with key plan recommendations, if the recommendations that we presented to you today are adopted, this is how we see each of these tools addressing each of those particular topics. So you can see they could all potentially hit below 60 or 50% AMI households. I should note, or I would like to note that, so it is really Luigi that is the one that produces the most 80% and below units. The other ones do require, or at least strongly incentivize, 60% or below already, I should say. But they could certainly be deeper and they could be stronger. But as you can see here again, the bond is just really one of the city's most powerful tools because it can be used for all of these different potential strategies. The Housing Trust Fund, again, is doing a great job doing what Housing Trust Funds should do. So I would suggest that you continue to support it, but expand its scope a little bit to include home repairs, possibly use it as part of a funders collaborative or some kind of land acquisition or housing acquisition fund. Luigi, has limited applicability, but it's obviously really important because it involves market rate developers and creates those mixed income communities. And then last, city-owned land could be used for land banking, possibly for some kind of homeowner assistance. If a DPA program is not implemented or supported, and of course it could also, and does to an extent already, provide options for deeper AMIs and for longer affordability periods. So the headlines for each of these tools is reimagine Luigi to make it deeper or longer affordability, build on the Housing Trust Fund's success, and particularly pair it with other funding sources to cover non-capital costs that the bond is not able to repair, but also those home repair programs and acquisition. Use the grant to expand impact. Leverage the bond dollars. Use it for land acquisition to get property out of the speculative market right now, and use it for affordable housing development later. Leverage partnerships. Use it for grants for smaller developers to help grow the ecosystem. And to the degree that it can be done, use the bond bill to help support home ownership. For city-owned land banking for the long-term affordability, land is so limited, especially in Asheville. It's really important that the city acquire property to protect affordability in the long run. And then above all else, collaboration is key. When I was doing these analyses, it just became abundantly clear that the most equitable, the most efficient, the most effective are when other players come to the table and it's not just the city doing the work or paying the money. So whenever possible, make sure that an additional city tool is being used, that there's another, that the county is investing, that there is dogwood money or federal dollars. The tools can be highly, highly effective when they're done and used collaboratively. What time do we have? 4:05. Should we take questions for tools or should I move on with 25 minutes left?
Move on.
If we move on, okay. All right, so the implementation roadmap. So this is the final part of the plan, or the near final part of the plan that articulates how to actually achieve the strategies that we're recommending the city adopt. And there's 3 key considerations for the implementation plan. Number 1 is that the city invest in people and systems. The programs, cannot be administered without adequate staff, the necessary tools, or the necessary systems in place. We need to have a data collection system before Luigi starts requiring data collection. There needs to be additional staff capacity to implement new programs and expanding existing ones, which relates to scaling the teams and city staff infrastructure being successful. It's also really important to point out that meaningful integration of racial equity into the internal systems is key to assessing the impact of city funding and if the city is reaching those with the greatest needs. And that takes resources, that takes time, that takes being thoughtful. And so it's important that the city invests in that if it's taking racial equity seriously. Again, data-informed decision-making. Asheville's housing market is not a monolith, so it's important to understand the needs and challenges as much as possible of different areas. We're suggesting requiring the utilization of credible quantitative and qualitative data sources, and understanding the data gaps and data limitations that the city currently has. And then importantly, again, the plan is a living document. The housing market will change, organizational capacity and the city's capacity and goals will change, so the implementation plan should be reviewed annually to address issues of urgency, relevancy, feasibility, and what other opportunities may arise over the course of the 10-year planning horizon. So the implementation roadmap has 4 particular components, though it has a couple other columns, but primarily it's when. Is this a top priority that'll get started in year 1? Is this a short-term priority that'll get started in years 2 or 3, middle term, 4 to 5 years, and long-term, 6 to 10 years? How will the strategy be supported? You won't be seeing them on today's presentation, but the roadmap has specific actions within each strategy that articulates what the city needs to do to implement those. Who will be the key stakeholders engaged with uplifting this strategy? We know that this is not going to be all on the city, so we've made sure to pull out as many other stakeholders and organizations that we think would be relevant for each of these strategies. And of course, funding. Can it come out of the bond? Can it come out of the Housing Trust Fund? Does it just require staff time? Would it need to come out of the general fund? Whatever the case may be, where is the funding coming from? So I'm going to, with 22 minutes, run through the year one and short term, which is that 2 to 3 year priorities. So, and especially since we're nearing the end, please feel free to interrupt. So the year one priorities are essentially a nexus of trying to meet the greatest need, figuring out what already has momentum in the community, and what is feasibly within the city's power to implement and finance within year one. And I also want to reemphasize that these all imply that these strategies are getting started in this year, not necessarily that they're completed. The first two are a perfect example, supporting the construction of affordable for sale and rental housing. Both of those are top priority needs from the community. That column was based on the community feedback from March and a poll that we launched online. We asked folks to tell us what their priorities were, and so if there's an X in that box, that's what that indicates. As well, the implementers and the possible funding sources. So supporting, number one, supporting affordable for sale housing and rental housing through land acquisition, through, well, those two buckets in particular are particularly large, but I won't go into too much detail, but through land acquisition, through regulations, through funding, continuing to support affordable for sale and rental housing. Incentivizing transit-oriented development and accessible development. The city's already working with the Planning and Urban Design Department as they're updating the UDO. Enhance the existing city tools, and in essence, adopting the recommendations that we just went through. Increasing awareness of existing resources and rights. There are resources available to folks. It's just a matter of providing the right education material and the right resources so that folks understand what is available to them right now. Increasing the regulatory incentives citywide to increase housing production, such as density bonuses, development requirements like a by right development at 10 or 20% are affordable. Supporting other plans and policy initiatives that diversify housing choice, such as the Missing Middle Study. Requiring all developments that receive city funding to accept rental assistance. Right now, I believe it's only one of them that truly requires it. Modifying review thresholds, as we've already discussed, with affordable housing units, and continuing to partner with nonprofits on homeownership readiness initiatives. So as you can see from these year one strategies, yeah, those were the two. These have momentum, these are meeting the greatest need, and these are either capable of being implemented or funded right now, or at least in October, when we, in theory, will start to implement these. So for years 2 and 3, increasing the acceptance of rental assistance. We talked about that already earlier today, increasing the of rental choice, rental vouchers. Expanding the home repair resources for homeowners. That is an excellent anti-displacement tool. When people are not able to age in place, or their home they're not able to afford the repairs that they need to keep their home safe, expanding home repair resources can really be a huge anti-displacement strategy. And there already is the Asheville Regional Coalition for Home Repair, so we're suggesting that the city partner with them, support their efforts, and expand the scope of their work. Supporting a down payment or mortgage subsidy program, increasing the investment in community land trusts for sale and for rent, continuing to develop city-owned land for affordable housing, and that includes potentially acquiring and land banking more land now, aligning housing development priority areas with capital improvement planning. So obviously, as I said earlier, if the city is already putting in water and sewer, updating a road or sidewalk or whatever the case may be, trying to align housing development with those kinds of investments, because it'll save money for the developers. It makes the projects more efficient from the city standpoint. There's more density potentially, so that's a really important one. Extending tenant protections, including access to legal assistance. Of course, tenant rights are not the strongest in the state of North Carolina, but Pisgah Legal does everything that they can to protect tenants, so improving the support that they receive would be fantastic. Increasing the capacity of the public sector by fostering collaboration and increasing resources. And so that could be, I know I've talked to several of you about potentially having a joint session with the county commissioners to talk about housing priorities and housing funding. So that's one potential example of expanding the public sector by fostering collaboration, but really bringing all of these people together, because this is all, everyone has a vested interest in housing of these particular groups. I think this, yeah. So then providing emergency rental assistance. This one is a little, it's so important, but can be so effective. Keeping people in their home can be just aside from the morals of it, it is a financially beneficial thing to keep somebody in the house as opposed to needing to build an emergency shelter or pay for other services. And so an emergency rental assistance program supporting the Buncombe County one, or whatever the case may be, would be really beneficial to the renters who are hurting right now and facing being priced out of their homes. Prioritizing legacy residents for city subsidized developments, increasing city funds dedicated to housing affordability efforts, educating local builders and developers in housing needs, funding, design guidelines, so that's like that developer forum that you mentioned, council member, and reducing regulatory barriers citywide, which I know the cities, or the CED is already working with, planning and urban design on. So, I just said a lot. I'd love to get some more feedback. Did anything, well, go
Yes.
ahead.
Okay, the one thing that I was in year one,
Yes.
I mean, I would just like to see the rental, the home repair being placed in year one has been a top priority.
Yes.
And reason being is because like you, some of the same reasons you said, for the anti-displacement of people having to leave their homes, because what I have noticed here, I'm a realtor here in Asheville, and what I have noticed that there are many homes here that people, basically, if they could get assistance with repair, then they could live in their homes. And not only that, they could probably lease out rooms to other people.
That's a good point.
The landlord, from the landlord's perspective, what happens with the voucher situation, because a lot of them will not accept vouchers, so to incentivize helping landowners bring their homes up to par,
Yes.
where they qualify for
Yes.
the vouchers, then that would add additional housing. So I think that the home repair, and we expand it to actually be able to, we could probably get homes up and running within months for people here if we actually looked at what we could do. And in fact, in some of the legacy neighborhoods, you'll see a lot of vacant homes that were owned by minority community. However, they're in high disrepair. Basically, maybe we could start actually working with them to actually repair those homes, but actually have them actually work some kind of way where it benefits helping us provide more rental homes for our community, because we have lots of vouchers, but no one wants to rent. So if we could actually use that program to help landlords get houses up and running, that they take vouchers, and people basically to be able to stay in their homes, because that's going to keep us from bleeding homes, because they are bleeding homes just because the homes are in such disrepair.
Yeah.
And I think by actually doing that, setting up some type of program, I think that could really help the minority or just not only Black community, it'll help a lot of people that are struggling to stay in their homes.
I do have a question about that, and it's not my idea. A neighbor brought it forward, so I'm thankful for Community Solutions to bring to the potluck of ideas here. One of the things that came up is that our demolition permits are maybe low, and some cities are looking at increasing their demolition permits for residential and commercial deconstruction to put into home repair. So it can work as part of like placemaking and anti-displacement. If a home is going to be torn down in a neighborhood, can you put it into a fund to put a roof on someone's house, for example?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if maybe that solution could be part of a funding strategy that if it's legal and it's being done in other cities, it's money that's we're not tapped into yet.
What's the money? What's the,
So
for the
right
sale
now,
of the property, or for what is it?
Well, if you apply for a permit to tear down a house, like what happened on my street, what is it, $75?
Is that 500, I think?
Okay, so there's a
Okay.
permit fee,
There's
$75,
a permit
$500.
fee, and if it's higher significantly
Oh,
than what it is now, should it be actually $3,000 to tear down a home? Because you're
Okay.
gonna tear
Interesting.
down a 100-year-old home that someone bought for 200 to knock it down to build $1 million home in a neighborhood. It's like,
Gotcha.
there's an incentive to maybe have adaptive reuse, but also if you're gonna do it, then it goes into a home repair fund, and that's an untapped revenue or
I
unidentified.
like it.
I
I
thought one
like
of the
it.
basic problems with fees in North Carolina is fees have to be, they have to be equivalent of the cost of administering the service, and they can't be used as a revenue source in that way. Brad is on deck for this, but that's like continues to be a challenge I don't know where it is that you're seeing that, but I'm guessing it's a city not in North Carolina, but I don't know.
So if it's possible to put another funding on there, I'd love to know if that's doable.
well, I love the idea, Kim, great idea, to the neighbor. Speaking to Councilwoman Kilgore's points, I kind of guessed that these were in year 2 simply because of the budget cycle. Because we've already gone through, HGF is zeroed out, general fund, we just went through this budget.
For home repair. you're talking
Yeah,
about
what
for
she's talking, I mean, all your points are incredibly great and accurate. I just don't know that we did anything this year that we could jumpstart it more than what's already happened. The only thing left under there that hasn't fully happened is some of the home funds for the regional housing
I mean, I
guess
don't
the-
understand.
We wouldn't have bond money until year
until
2.
next year,
Yeah.
yeah.
So-
I
Okay, so that's the
agree,
re-
but I assumed
So
it
we
was a
don't have the money to
logistical
do, we don't have the
reason.
money to
Yeah.
actually get it.
But the
jumpstart.
year
Okay.
one starts October, so I
We'll
mean,
have-
you'd really be in line to get it teed up for
Maybe,
the
yeah.
July 1 fiscal year. If the bond's
Yeah.
passed, you'd have a source of funds. And we'll have to do a deep dive on the home repair, because we have other folks in the community that are doing home
Mhm.
repair. So I assume we would be bolstering those existing programs.
Exactly.
And just I don't know if they're spending all their money. I don't know if they have barriers to getting all their money out in the community. If it's more the issue of trying to get people signed up, make them aware of the programs and getting them, I don't,
Yeah.
whatever. We'll have to do some more exploration
Because I did see-
of that.
When I worked at a nonprofit, one of the barriers was the income. So the income requirement was so low that a lot of people who could have benefited, we would think,
Got
Didn't-
disqualified.
were
'Cause you didn't-
disqualified.
So in other words, we need to actually
You mentioned this.
change.
Yeah, because you can see how
Just-
people can't
Yeah.
afford to put a new roof on their home,
Mhm.
but they don't make enough money to pay
'Cause
for
they're on
that,
Social
but then
Security.
they don't qualify for the.
So we need to probably raise that.
Or
And
figure-
also in the
figure out
Perhaps by
past,
geographic region.
the value
There
of
you
the
go.
home was
Yeah.
Perhaps by
a
geo.
barrier. Like I
Mm-hmm.
remember
Yeah.
at one time, the housing value needed to be like 210,000 or something ridiculous
Yeah,
for.
it's probably
I
at the
remember you
review,
talking about
yeah,
this.
check out
City.
those
That's one of
numbers.
those
But
things.
I do have a
Maybe.
question, I don't remember which one it was, but it was focusing on, it said something like legacy or long-term Asheville
The
residents.
prioritized legacy residents for city subsidized.
What does legacy mean? How long?
So
Does
that
that mean if I lived in my house 2 years, I'm legacy? Does
That is a good question. And that's one that I do not.
You're a legacy. You are a legacy.
Like, I was just, because
You're a
I'm just
legend.
wondering what that means.
That is open for interpretation. It could mean the legacy neighborhoods. It could mean families that have been impacted by urban renewal.
Well, who in
It could
legacy
be-
neighborhoods? We decide?
The-
Or what if you used to live in a legacy neighborhood and were displaced 3
Right.
years ago? What's
Right.
that?
No, I mean, it's a great point and a conversation. It's difficult for sure, to figure out exactly how to do that, but.
I want to chime back in on, thanks for that question. I think we use it a lot, and getting clear is really useful. I just want to go back to the discussion around home repair, just to chime in that I feel like when I look at the suite of tools that you all evaluated, I'm proud that I think we're doing a pretty good job. I think that the need is far more than where we're at, and so we need to keep growing. But I do feel like I have a lot of curiosity of like, what would it look like if we complemented what's out there already? I feel like it's a strategy that our local government hasn't dabbled in, and if we're really trying to address less harm and more equity, I hear this sentiment a lot as we see this out-migration from our Black residents. And so I have a lot of curiosity here, so I just want to make sure to chime in another voice of
And do you know of any
enthusiasm for
other
this one.
municipalities, you know, you mentioned rental assistance, is there a mortgage assistance?
Well, yeah, so we said support a down payment assistance and/or mortgage subsidy program. That one is, it's right here.
Okay.
And we have an effort there, but we were hitting some roadblocks. It'd be nice to have an update of like, are we through those roadblocks, or are we rolling on that? That's less for you and more just an inquiry.
Staff's giving us this. I mean, and this is one of these times where, it's so great to go through all of these opportunities and ideas. And I'm glad we're being somewhat methodical about it, because we have tried to jump on a few programs in the past, and staff has struggled, a year or two to try to figure out how to implement it and study other cities that have other systems and look what we've got in terms of our resources locally. And then there's some, we can't get it launched.
Right.
And it takes a lot of time and effort. So to the extent that we're able to work with partners in the community that are already doing programs that are working, that's the easiest way to scale those up, provide more funds for things like that.
Most are coming through the home funds right now, on the rental repair. I have one literal question and two philosophical questions.
Great.
We've talked a lot, sorry. So we recently approved, I think it was with the CDBG funds, a little pilot program of a new offshoot in the community that's trying to do 2 units, backyard units, relating wraparound services for, I think it was addiction specialization. Anyways, do you think that trying these new little pilots is worth our time too? Because, it sounds really great. It could become something big, but we didn't really address, like, should we be looking for more programs like that? Little offshoots.
That's a great question. I think, one of the reasons why I would say some of these priorities, strategies are maybe a little boring, because it is plussing up what you guys are already doing well. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, I just
lost
wanted to
my
know
train of thought.
if we should be spending our time
Oh, right.
and staff,
piloting.
because we have a staff shortage, and so should we be investing in some smaller offshoots that might be helpful
Right,
to create 2 units in this case?
right. I think the overwhelming theme of this is that the city can't go at this alone. And if there is a nonprofit partner or a affordable housing partner who's willing to help that, and there can be, that sounds like at least some of it sounds like it's bond eligible, so like there could be a fund of those kinds of like grant opportunities for them to take it on themselves.
One of the things we've talked about, and just to give it more context, is like we're on this schedule now where we're lining up with the county.
Right.
So big projects can come through and have all the partners at the table. But then these little guys
Yeah,
don't really follow that. So it's just kind of this theoretical thing we're talking about, like, should we have a smaller fund somewhere you can approach any time for some of
Yes.
these little guys?
yes, I
Okay.
do think so. Yes,
Okay,
I
that's
do
helpful.
think that. But I think
Yeah.
launching new programs, to your
Okay.
point, takes a while. And so to the degree that you could get that program administration implemented by a partner as opposed to the city, I think would be beneficial.
The philosophical ones.
Great.
We talked about this before, but sometimes what we hear as a council is, look, you just need to reduce regulations, you need to open up the market, you need to do everything you can to let the market run wild, and you'll get the units you want, and the overall cost will come down. But I'm starting to wonder if, but for these programs we're talking about, if we would actually get any affordability, if we'd see that trickle down, because I'm starting to think it's not just supply, that we won't get it unless we demand it or incentivize it, because we're so far behind, right? Like, if we had 10,000 new units built tomorrow, no affordability built in, they wouldn't naturally be affordable, right?
Yeah.
I guess I just kind of want to hear you say, yes, we've got to do these programs, because free market in your area
Yes,
is
you have to do
not
these
gonna work.
programs.
Okay.
Thank you.
But do you know what I
Yes,
mean by
I
that?
do.
Like, we're
Yeah.
told that a lot, so sometimes we can't just deregulate our way out of this.
Yes.
We're a small city, we've got land complications, expensive land, okay.
Yes.
Philosophical thing, short-term rentals, nowhere in this conversation. So when we start talking about housing units, which I looked up the census data, we are at 47,000 housing units now. But we think we have like 2,000 in short-term rentals. I would love to know if you have any experience kind of around short-term rentals and the impact on housing and affordability. And also if we factor that in when we say the demand, like we said we need, what, 14,000 households coming in by 2050? And
Right.
are we subtracting the extracted units from this, I guess, in the data?
No, I mean, that doesn't include potentially, or well, the 14,000, no, I can't imagine that would necessarily include.
'Cause it's
like,
just
vacation
housing
homes.
units,
It's-
right?
Well, it's to meet the population growth. So in theory, people own multiple properties in Asheville, so it doesn't, I guess, account for that factor of short-term rentals or vacation homes or whatever the case may be, but
I just wonder if we're starting at a inaccurate number, like we really have less households than the data says because so many are short-term rental here.
oh,
Do you know what
see
I mean?
you're
Like,
saying.
do we really
We
need?
do have a number of.
It's zoned for residential, but it's used commercially.
Right.
Right.
Well, what we have is a number of unoccupied second home.
We have that too, it's 15% or so.
But you don't like that number because you think maybe
Well, I
short-term
just-
rentals are counted as occupied homes?
Well, there's no way, we're just saying households,
Well,
right?
the one thing I will say with short-term rentals, basically, because you may have noticed that the market is sort of shifting and changing right now. A lot of things are happening. So I will say that a lot of short-term rentals are basically converting to longer-term rentals.
That's
because
wonderful.
the inventory is actually sort of shifting. So that's what happens when, we're sort of, nothing stays the same.
Yes.
And it's all rapidly changing.
Yeah.
And so, but that is one thing that I've noticed that has been occurring. And also, I have noticed that we have had an influx of affordable units being built by some small builders, some larger builders, in the market range of 350. And it has had a tremendous impact on slowing the market and bringing properties down, prices of properties down. So those things do impact
Yeah.
the full market, and you can see it right, I mean, it's not like it takes a long time. So those things are actually happening right now.
We are seeing some saturation, I'd say, where the long-term rents are starting to match the short-term rents, and one has more
Yeah, because
hassle.
it's, yes.
But I'm curious, in your perspective, how short-term rentals impact housing markets. I mean, in our community, we have a lot. At one point, we had the highest long-term housing being occupied by short-term use in the entire nation.
We might still,
We might still.
we don't know.
So, and it was like 3% of all of our housing stock was being used for short-term use. That was the statistic. I think it was 2020, so,
Right.
yeah.
To answer, as a philosophical answer, I have not seen any studies that say, though there certainly may be some out there, studies that say short-term rental share is directly correlated to rising rents. That said, everywhere is facing a housing supply shortage. And anything that takes away an opportunity from a longtime resident to stay where they want to live affordably, it doesn't advance, I think, a lot of the city's vision.
So then we're subsidizing a commercial use because it could be, why would you rent to someone for 1,000 when you could rent for 4,000?
Right.
Can you go back to page 29 for a second?
Just to close that loop too, before the question, it does seem like the higher rental incomes for these short-term rentals are raising the housing value of that facility because it has greater revenue potential.
Right.
So you go to sell it and you know, oh, well, you can have this
You can rent it
revenue,
out
and
for
that values the house higher, which of course the whole industry is based on comps. So you have a
But so
trickle
does
effect.
conditional
And that's why,
zoning.
and that's why basically you should consider short-term rentals as commercial property because they're
Right.
income producing. And you can't really compare income producing with residential sales.
Yeah.
So
Did you get the point I
therefore, we
was
actually
making
need
about
to,
conditional zoning?
I mean, that's something that I guess
How
has to be
what
handled at
triggers
state, but that's really the problem.
Triggers what?
How it raises the prices, yeah. So the point I was making about conditional zoning possibly having the same thing is if I have a piece of property that's zoned that I can do 49, but someone comes in and wants to do double, then the seller starts to price in the ability to get more than what's zoned.
Right.
So then or sometimes if we require X% affordable housing, what the developer will turn around and do is raise the rates for the remaining
Right, right.
properties. And so are we then increasing the fair market value anytime you tinker?
Yeah,
This is the
we're
question.
really like killing the workforce region of it. You know, those folks are suffering from it because we're achieving success in the lower AMIs, the higher AMIs don't need us, and the workforce is getting lost in the middle.
Well, not by ours, because the workforce is that 80 to 100, and we're knocking it out of the ballpark.
Okay.
Let's do,
yeah, Kim, go ahead.
Councilwoman Bonner's question.
I'm looking for where we're gonna talk about land use incentive grant, Luigi, and what we're incentivizing, especially if we're going to make a shift towards voucher set aside versus voucher accepting. And I guess the reason I'm thinking about this is a developer reached out to me and wanted to talk about a project, and they said, well, we're running into this issue about voucher accepting, but then what happens if no one applies? And I was like, oh, well, we know there are people on lists with vouchers.
Yeah.
If we did voucher set-asides, would that get more to the spirit of like what we're trying to get to as far as our equity goals? But I don't see that in here. It wasn't explicit to look at the difference between them, so I was trying to
No, that's
help
okay.
identify something that's missing.
No, thank you. I appreciate that.
So the way I understand, we were talking about the county tax assessor trying to, I mean, the tax rate is still the same for commercial, residential, industrial. It doesn't matter the property, but if it is a short-term rental, I think some have made the argument that it's producing income that gives it a higher value, like a hotel.
Yeah.
And so what the county has done so far, as far as I know, is they are now sending known short-term rental operators the form you have to fill out when you're a commercial user to put
Okay.
down your personal property items to be taxed within the home. I don't know what's come of that. I think last year was the first year they tried to do it, so we should.
I remember when treating short-term rentals as commercial had another strategy behind it, because it would entail greater regulations, including things like ADA accessibility, and it could be harder to create them if they were in that
And that's
level.
true,
If
too.
they were, right,
Yeah.
and that is
Yeah.
an
That's true,
argument the
too.
hoteliers make on that front, is that they have to comply with all the safety regulations
That
of
they
a,
Why don't
of
they
a
just-
commercial
Yeah.
place, but the short-term rental doesn't. But I don't know how the tax appraisers are now valuing properties that are short-term rental properties versus a residential, single-family occupied
Yeah.
home. If
Or
they're
historic
Because I'm just
giving them-
wondering, locally,
Mhm.
can we do
Historic
something about that? Because
It seems like there should, because ours city is not a situation where a property could or could not be used as a short-term rental. We literally now have units that are grandfathered, that other units they'll not be able to do short-term rentals. But these other units are grandfathered indefinitely, even to successor owners. So you'd think they would have a different value
Exactly.
than somebody who owns a condo that's restricted and can't be short-term rented in the downtown, for example.
I've also heard what a terrible situation that is when we look at the equity lens of that, who has had the capital to invest in short-term rental
Oh,
properties?
absolutely, it's completely disproportionate, yes, no doubt about it.
I realize, well, we're at 4:35. I do have a couple more slides. I'd be happy to ask these questions, but I want to defer to you all on, if you need to eat before tonight.
The only thing I was going to ask is if you ever look at movership rates.
Movership rates.
Yeah, I guess that's
The in-migration, out-migration?
No, I think the census keeps track of it. It's, last time I heard it, we were 15%. So
What is
high
it?
movership rate is bad. It means that the number of people who live this year in a house lived somewhere else the year before.
Oh.
So movership ratio is, and that
Yes.
can cause a lot of havoc, and it's harder and higher in these high-demand communities
Mhm.
where prices are going up. And families are moving, they're changing schools. It's a whole, series of quality of life issues. But
Yeah.
it's good to know, and I think that ours is fairly high compared to other cities in the state. And we may
Okay.
want to be incorporating that into our everyday knowledge.
Thank you. All right, keep going. Next steps. All right, so in progress, we are incorporating the final edits into our affordable housing plan. By the end of the month, we'll have our graphically designed and published affordable housing plan. This summer will be the general obligation bond fund prioritization discussions. August through October, staff, HCD, and AHAC will work to create work plans for implementing specific strategies, so really getting down into the weeds and putting some dates to specific actions. And then in October, beginning those year one strategies. So again, key takeaways from today is that the Affordable Housing Plan is a 10-year planning horizon and identifies tangible strategy recommendations to help build a more equitable and sustainable housing ecosystem in the community. The plan process began in September 2023 and is nearing its completion. We looked at these 4 tools in particular: the Land Use Incentive Grant, the Housing Trust Fund, the Affordable Housing Bond, and city-owned land. And the strategies that I presented today are for the first 3 years of the 10-year planning horizon, based on impact and what's within the city's power to feasibly implement. But with that, I thank you all so much for your time and your thoughtfulness today. This was really exceptional. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, council, thank you very much for this presentation and indulging us in our long conversation, which was a good one. I think we do need to indicate to staff whether or not we're good with this implementation plan, because that's the idea. They'll be off and running with what was proposed here today. And maybe you want to say a few words about that.
I'm going to have Rachel say what the
She's
next
gonna
steps
herd the
are.
cats.
You're gonna-
Sure. So the next you'll hear from staff on this will be at your July Housing and Community Development Committee meeting. That's where we're going to be talking about the work plan for fiscal year 2025. And spoiler alert, the work plan is going to be a lot of what you heard from Jara today. So that's where we hope to work with the Housing and Community Development Committee on what that implementation strategy more specifically is going to be. We heard feedback today around questions that need to be answered around the WEEJ, for example. That's where we want to tease that out with you all to then identify the items that will go to the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and that staff will be working through over the course of the year. So you see on here, October is when we'll begin implementation of year 1 strategies. We think it'll take a couple of months working with the Housing and Community Development Committee, working with AHAC, also working with the Planning and Economic Development Committee on some of the more regulatory items to then decide what is it that we're going to focus on, what's going to be realistic for us to start or potentially get finished over the course of fiscal year 2025. So this is going to be an ongoing dialogue over the course of the next few months, but that's why work planning is so important and so impactful, and using these plans as the basis for how we implement and react to the feedback we get for you all is really our goal.
So are we?
Remind me, was that missing middle part that included planning, was that year 1 or year 2?
Missing middle.
Yeah.
Was year 1.
Okay, and
Yeah.
PED, remind me, where are we on the overlay?
Staff is expecting to come back to us in September.
That's good.
And
Okay.
between now and September, there's some other regulatory text amendments that we'll be looking at. And then next month, we're also going to be looking at strategies or like mini goals under our council goals for updating the UDO, since we all agree no one wants to do every single page of it. So there's some concurrence on that, but staff is coming back in September with that first missing middle.
Is that going to put us out of alignment time-wise?
Because I'm wondering
Is that too late?
if, when we vote on the citizen-initiated petition, will
A
that
flag
overlay
lots and
already be in place? Or
That
would
is
would it
how
have been considered?
We delayed the citizen petition till after we have this missing middle conversation.
Including the overlay?
Yes, overlay or preservation, whatever it's going to be called.
Yeah, staff is saying
Correct.
they want us to be clear about the goal and them to come back with the method, and so flexibility on is it an overlay or not, but that's the conversation they're teeing up for us.
I have a question for staff. I was talking to our planning director, Steph Mazzandales here, about some code changes that we're going to be seeing coming forward that are not technically missing middle necessarily, not necessarily part of this, that will range, this is P&Z initiated changes that'll, you know, for example, raise the threshold from 49 units up to a by right process for multifamily housing, things like that. And Steph, can you tell us about the timing of when those things are gonna hit us? And I'm just thinking about the Venn diagram of, is that going to trigger a conversation about the overlay before we're planning to talk about it in the context of this and missing middle?
And can I ask another question so she can respond to your question? And what, if any, role will the equity department play in any of this discussion?
Great, thank you, Mayor and Council. To answer your question about the timeline for the additional amendments, just to note that we will be going over that timeline at the PED meeting on July 8th and getting some feedback on it. But currently, we have a bundle of amendments that were coming to you at your meeting in August. There's only one, and then that first meeting in September, which is the same time that Councilwoman Ullman mentioned. So those do include the threshold amendments. They include amendments around parking. They include considerations of things like additions of duplexes. There's about 13 proposed text amendments in that. So, and to your note about inclusion of the equity department and the equity officer, so there are a couple things that we can do, but one of the things that we will do is include our equity officer in the any of the staff briefings leading up to the presentations to PED or at City Council. So she will be reviewing, for example, the potential overlay.
Well, and Steph, you had mentioned earlier today that you yourself are attending several meetings with legacy neighborhood representatives. There's going to be a series of meetings to specifically preview these proposed changes and get community input and feedback.
Great point, and maybe that's an extension of the answer for you, is that there's going to be an interdepartmental group that meets July 24th and then on a Wednesday in August to review all of these amendments with the legacy neighborhoods, and that will be a great opportunity for us to get some feedback.
And I'm also wondering if it's being considered that after these overlays are in place for other activities that the city does, will those same overlays be in place? I'm thinking about like transportation or.
Yeah, to be considered about what, yeah, that's absolutely a policy question for you all, is what this overlay is in regards to.
Okay.
Yeah, it makes me think of the recommendation we had of designating historic districts around some of these legacy neighborhoods, and to what end do we want the overlay? And it's been in the context of the missing middle recommendations, but I guess you're saying it could be in the context of other regulatory things as well. Okay.
That's what I'm
What I'm hoping.
Right, so that makes me wonder about the timing of well, I mean, to be fair, I don't know what the whole list is that's coming to us that are these sort of P&Z initiated in collaboration with staff code changes. Some of them may have nothing to do with legacy neighborhoods at all, but some of them may have the potential to impact legacy neighborhoods. So if there's a way to parse that out, PED, when you're doing your work, kind of flag that and figure out how that's going to be successful.
If we, Brad might be able to speak to this, so if we were to adopt something with an overlay around these legacy neighborhoods, it's in place. Then let's say we adopted another overlay for multifamily and transportation-oriented stuff. The underlying zoning prevails, right? So I don't know if Brad heard me.
Whichever is more restrictive.
You're making Brad's
Whichever is more
voice
restrictive.
multiple
But I'm
times
thinking,
restrictive.
to your point, I think they would have protections because the first one was adopted, right? Or
Well,
could.
What we really want to do over the next couple of weeks is to understand the universe. There is a lot
Me too.
of things related to trying, again, we're doing our best to address regulatory hurdles, whatever it is, related to delivering affordable housing. We definitely want to assess the recommendations from a perspective of, do they conflict? Do they impact displacement? I mean, there's a lot of assessment and analysis that has to happen, and scheduling of all of these things to come to you all, because we don't want to one-off all of these things, because we may be adopting something that conflicts with or negatively impacts our goal of achieving what we just heard in terms of the presentation. So looking at these incentives and reductions of standards, I shouldn't say reduction, but changes in the standards, we have to make sure that, again, they're achieving what our goals are, which are to deliver and increase the supply of affordable housing. And the issue becomes, does reduction actually yield affordable units?
What's going on there?
How, whoa.
Wrong door.
Okay, interesting. All right, so the long and short of it is we'll be coming through the committee of committees, giving a schedule, showing relationships between these various proposals, whether they are by P and Z and independent or outside, or what staff is going to recommend.
And a request I heard from our colleagues is for us on PED to take a look this coming month at the 13 text amendments that are
Right.
in the queue and give a good think and reflection on, how is the overlay impacting these places, and is there any staggering that we need to do, and can definitely kind of take that list and talk individually with councilwomen too, to go over that timeline and those proposals too. Well, we're just covering all the bases today. That's great.
Okay.
A lot of
so
progress.
Do,
We want housing.
good, and staff, did you get all you needed for today, out of today in terms of direction? And I'm seeing some nodding, smiling.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Council, any other comments before we take a quick break and reconvene our council meeting? All right, we're adjourned from the work session.